Welcome to Dark Night Tales. In 1854, on a forgotten plantation buried deep in American history, an enslaved black boy named Gideon Vance picked up a paintbrush, and what emerged on the canvas would leave grown men shaken, scholars confused, and records quietly buried. His work showed anatomy, light, shadow, and perspective that mirrored the mastery of Leonardo da Vinci himself, skills no enslaved child was ever supposed to learn. Tonight, we uncover how Gideon's impossible talent terrified art scholars, why his paintings vanished, and what history refused to explain. Gideon Vance was born in 1854 on a southern plantation at a time when being born black meant being born into bondage with no legal identity, no recorded birthday, and no recognized future beyond forced labor. There was no birth certificate, no written family lineage, only a first name assigned by the enslaver and a life immediately claimed as property. His mother, herself enslaved, was forced back to work within days of giving birth, and Gideon was raised in the quarters among exhaustion, fear, and silence rather than childhood comfort. From the moment of his birth, Gideon existed outside the systems that preserved history. Plantation records counted crops, livestock, and profits, but rarely the inner lives of enslaved children. What little is known comes from later testimonies, fragments of letters, and whispered accounts passed down generations. These sources describe Gideon as unusually observant even as a toddler, staring intensely at faces, hands, and shadows cast by firelight, as if memorizing them. Growing up enslaved meant Gideon had no access to books, art, formal instruction, or tools meant for learning. Any display of intelligence beyond obedience was often punished, not encouraged. Yet, within this environment of deprivation, something extraordinary was forming. His birth did not mark the arrival of a future artist. It marked the beginning of a mystery that history was unprepared to acknowledge, let alone explain. Gideon Vance's secret revealed itself not in a gallery or schoolroom, but in the most unlikely place, on the rough wooden walls of the slave quarters and storage sheds, where no one thought to look closely. Using bits of charcoal from burned firewood, crushed brick, and even dried clay mixed with water, Gideon began sketching whenever he could steal a moment alone. These were not childish doodles. They were faces with weight and emotion, hands twisted in tension, and bodies drawn with a balance that suggested deep understanding rather than imitation. The first person to notice was not an art scholar, but an overseer who stumbled upon a wall covered in figures so lifelike they seemed to watch him move. Accounts describe the man freezing in place, unsettled by the realism, the way light fell naturally across cheekbones, the accurate proportions of limbs, the depth created on a flat surface. Word spread quickly through the plantation, carried in whispers mixed with fear rather than praise. When the plantation owner finally saw the drawings, his reaction was not pride but alarm. An enslaved child was not supposed to possess such skill, especially without instruction. The sketches were ordered scrubbed away, yet more appeared, on fence posts, barn interiors, even the dirt floor traced with a stick. What terrified those in power was not just Gideon's talent, but the implication behind it, a mind observing, remembering, and creating beyond control. From that moment on, Gideon was watched, not as a child, but as something dangerous. What truly unsettled those who examined Gideon Vance's work was not merely how well he drew, but what he seemed to understand without ever being taught. His figures showed precise human anatomy. Shoulders that rotated naturally, hands with correct bone structure, muscles that tensed realistically beneath the skin. Faces were not flat or symbolic. They carried depth, asymmetry, and emotion, capturing expressions that shifted subtly with the angle of the head, Witnesses later described how Gideon instinctively placed bodies in correct proportion, something even trained artists struggled to master. Heads were sized accurately to torsos, limbs followed natural ratios, and figures appeared grounded in space rather than floating unnaturally. There was no evidence he had copied from books or paintings. None were available to him. His knowledge seemed observational, absorbed from watching people labor, rest, suffer, and endure around him. Most disturbing to observers was Gideon's use of perspective and light. He shaded forms to suggest three-dimensional volume, understood where light sources would naturally fall, and used shadow to create realism, techniques associated with Renaissance masters, not enslaved children on isolated plantations. This level of comprehension challenged everything white scholars believed about intelligence, race, and education at the time. Because there was no acceptable explanation, rumors began to circulate. Some whispered that Gideon was imitating something unseen. Others claimed his gift was unnatural or dangerous. In a society built on the lie of black inferiority, Gideon's untrained mastery was not celebrated. It was feared. When word of Gideon Vance's drawings spread beyond the plantation, the comparisons that followed were whispered carefully and only behind closed doors. A visiting clergyman and two educated men, both familiar with European art, were reportedly shown a surviving sketch that had escaped destruction. What stunned them was not just the subject, but the method. Gideon's work reflected techniques associated with the Renaissance: balanced composition, naturalistic posture, and a subtle understanding of chiaroscuro, the interplay of light and shadow used by masters like Leonardo da Vinci. Observers noted how Gideon positioned figures within imagined space, giving depth to flat surfaces in a way that suggested linear perspective. Foreground figures appeared closer, background elements receded naturally, and nothing felt accidental. The drawings showed restraint, no excessive lines, no frantic marks, only deliberate strokes placed with confidence. This was not mimicry. It was execution. Such comparisons were dangerous. To acknowledge that an enslaved black child could independently arrive at techniques developed over centuries of European art history threatened the racial hierarchy of the time. These men reportedly stopped short of praising Gideon publicly, choosing instead to describe the work as disturbing or inexplicable. One account claims a sketch was quietly removed and never returned, possibly to prevent further discussion. Rather than elevating Gideon, the Renaissance comparisons sealed his fate. His talent was no longer seen as remarkable. It was seen as a contradiction too powerful to exist. In a society invested in erasing black genius, likening Gideon Vance to Leonardo da Vinci was not an honor. It was a problem. The plantation owners' response to Gideon Vance's talent was not admiration, it was fear disguised as authority. At first, they treated the drawings as a strange curiosity, something to be erased and forgotten. But as Gideon's work continued to appear, more refined and more unsettling each time, their attitude hardened. An enslaved child who could observe, interpret, and recreate the human form with such accuracy represented a mind they could not control. In the logic of slavery, intelligence was dangerous. Creativity suggested independence, and independence threatened the entire system. The owners worried that Gideon's talent might inspire other enslaved people to see themselves differently, to imagine more than survival. Orders were given to confiscate any materials he used, to restrict where he could go, and to keep him under constant watch. There are accounts that Gideon was forbidden from drawing altogether, punished when marks were found, and forced into harder labor to break his focus. Some sources suggest his sketches were deliberately destroyed, burned alongside old tools and scraps, as if eliminating evidence could erase the problem itself. Visitors were warned not to speak of what they had seen. To the plantation owners, Gideon was no longer just property. He was a liability. His gift did not increase their wealth, and it challenged the lie that justified their power. So they responded the only way the system allowed, by suppressing, silencing, and attempting to erase the boy behind the brush. As whispers of Gideon Vance's abilities refused to die, the plantation owners took a step that revealed just how unsettled they truly were. Rather than displaying Gideon's work publicly, they quietly summoned a small circle of educated men, individuals with knowledge of anatomy, classical art, and European schooling. These men did not arrive as patrons or teachers. They came in secrecy, under the understanding that what they were about to see was not meant for public discussion. The surviving sketches were shown indoors, away from the enslaved quarters, often at night. According to later recollections, the scholars examined the drawings in silence, tracing lines with their eyes rather than their fingers. They asked how the boy had learned perspective, why his proportions followed classical ratios, and where he had seen such techniques. Each question led to the same uncomfortable answer: nowhere. Unable to attribute Gideon's talent to instruction or imitation, the scholars reportedly avoided formal documentation. Writing it down would have required acknowledgement that an enslaved black child possessed a level of artistic understanding rivaling European masters. Some advised that the matter be left alone. Others suggested removing Gideon from view entirely. No official report was filed. No sketches were catalogued. The visit ended as quietly as it began. The secrecy surrounding the scholar's examination was not meant to protect Gideon. It was meant to protect the beliefs of a society that could not afford for his genius to be real. Once no rational explanation could be offered for Gideon Vance's talent, fear filled the void. In the mid-1800s, anything that disrupted the accepted social order was often labeled unnatural, and Gideon's genius did exactly that. Plantation owners, overseers, and even visiting scholars began to speak of his ability in uneasy tones, suggesting it was something inherited wrongly, inspired by dark forces, or guided by something unseen. This fear was rooted in more than superstition. It was ideological panic. Slavery depended on the belief that black minds were inferior, incapable of refinement or intellectual mastery. Gideon's drawings shattered that belief every time a face emerged from the wall with lifelike emotion. If his talent was acknowledged as natural, then the entire justification for enslavement began to collapse. Rumors spread that Gideon should be isolated, watched closely, or kept from influencing others. Some accounts claim enslaved people were discouraged from speaking to him, as if genius itself were contagious. His quiet focus, his habit of observing rather than speaking, only deepened the unease surrounding him. By labeling Gideon's gift as unnatural, those in power found a way to fear it rather than face it. Genius, when it appeared in the wrong body, was no longer celebrated. It was treated as a threat that had to be contained, controlled, or erased. After the scholar's secret visit and the growing fear surrounding Gideon Vance's abilities, his artwork began to vanish systematically and deliberately. Sketches that once covered walls were scrubbed clean. Loose drawings, hidden behind crates or tucked beneath floorboards, were confiscated and destroyed. What could not be erased immediately was locked away, removed from the plantation, or quietly burned under the excuse of cleaning or maintenance. This disappearance was not accidental. It followed a pattern. Any surface Gideon touched was inspected, any mark treated as evidence of something dangerous. Overseers were instructed to search for drawings, and Gideon was denied access to charcoal, tools, or even idle moments where his hands could move freely. The goal was not correction, it was elimination. There are unverified accounts that a small number of his sketches were taken by visitors and never returned, possibly hidden in private collections or destroyed to prevent future scrutiny. If such pieces survived, they were stripped of names, dates, and origins, severed from Gideon himself. By the time the plantation records were later reviewed, there was no trace of Gideon's art, only rumors that something extraordinary once existed and was intentionally removed. The disappearance of his work ensured that future generations would have nothing tangible to question the narrative. Without the art, the genius could be dismissed as legend, and that, perhaps, was the point. As Gideon Vance's artwork disappeared, so did Gideon himself. After a certain point, his name simply stopped appearing in plantation records. No labor logs, no punishment notes, no mention of sale or transfer. In a system obsessed with documentation of property, that silence is striking. It suggests not accident, but intention. Some accounts hint that Gideon was moved to another plantation under a different name, a common tactic used to sever troublesome individuals from their past. Others whisper that he was assigned to grueling labor meant to exhaust both body and mind, leaving no energy for observation or creation. There are darker rumors, too, of confinement, of illness neglected, of a child whose usefulness ended once his talent became inconvenient. What is certain is this: Gideon's fate was never formally recorded. No death entry, no bill of sale, no emancipation note. History closed its eyes and turned the page. By erasing Gideon from the written record, those in power ensured that no one could trace what became of the boy who challenged their beliefs. In slavery, disappearance did not require explanation. Silence was enough, and in Gideon Vance's case, that silence became the final act of control, making it impossible to know whether his genius was extinguished, survived in hiding, or lived on unrecognized under another name. History did not forget Gideon Vance by accident, it buried him by design. His story threatened too many carefully constructed lies. That genius required formal education, that greatness belonged to Europe, and that black intellect was naturally limited. An enslaved child who independently displayed mastery comparable to Leonardo da Vinci was not just an anomaly, it was a contradiction powerful enough to destabilize an entire worldview. Preserving Gideon's name would have required preserving his art, documenting his life, and admitting that brilliance can emerge even under brutal oppression. Instead, silence was chosen. Without paintings, without records, and without witnesses willing to speak publicly, Gideon's existence became easy to dismiss as rumor or myth. This pattern is not unique. Across history, countless black innovators, thinkers, and artists were erased because their achievements did not serve those in power. Gideon's story fits this pattern perfectly. His genius acknowledged in private, feared in public, and erased in official memory. Yet buried history has a way of resurfacing. The fragments that remain, the whispered accounts, the uneasy reactions, the unexplained destruction, tell us that Gideon Vance was real and that his talent was undeniable. His name was buried not because it lacked significance, but because it had too much.